All right, we're going to get started. Go ahead and grab a seat. Go ahead and grab a seat. Yep. All right, welcome. My name's Jeff Hunt. I'm the director of the Centennial Institute here at Colorado Christian University. So grateful that you're joining us for this discussion. Is Christian nationalism a threat to America? As we always begin, we begin with prayer and pledge. So please welcome CCU students Emma Rowe and Hannah Harrison.
All right, join me in prayer this evening. Lord, just thank you for bringing all of us here tonight. We just thank you so much for this opportunity. Please just open our hearts and our minds to what you would have us here tonight. Guide the conversation that we're having. In your name we pray, amen.
Won't you stand with me? All right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated.
Great. Well, friends, if this is your first time, welcome. We host an issue forum just about every month at the Centennial Institute. So if you'd like to be a part of these types of conversations, make sure you leave your email address with you, and we'll be happy to provide updates on future events like this. Now, typically, if this was a Western conservative summit, we would have some walk-on music and some fireworks and all that stuff, and I think this might be an appropriate song for walking on today. Give it a second. For Luigi and for Scott Wasserman.
Welcome to the main event. Let's get ready to rumble.
There we go. Now we got the crowd into it. Friends, please welcome some of our panelists and our moderator tonight, Luigi Del Porto and Scott Wasserman.
Thought you were going to play the Rocky theme.
I was waiting for Rocky. Good evening, everybody, and to all those who are watching and listening online, thank you for your time. Thank you for spending this gorgeous, really cold evening watching this debate. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the editor of Colorado Politics in the Denver Gazette, and I'm actually here with the singular purpose of selling you a subscription to Colorado Politics and the Denver Gazette. I am only half joking. It is my great honor and privilege to moderate this debate tonight, which happened like how everything else in life now happens. It's because of Twitter. You know, that perfect place for really incisive, nuanced, and wholesome conversation. Kidding aside, the fact that this is happening against the backdrop of a very polarized nation on a very difficult subject is remarkable. But perhaps I really should not be surprised. I am an immigrant to the United States. And in this country, what I see every day is people from all walks of life striving for the highest ideals, and which they do so through a robust, sometimes unwieldy, sometimes painful, but fully democratic exchange of ideas. And today's debate confirms for me what I envisioned the United States when I was growing up. It is a country full of life and optimism, full of flaws as well, but completely devoted to the proposition that we can get through our most difficult challenges through dialogue, through conversations such as what we're doing here. After all, we do share a common goal, and I think it's appropriate that we're holding this debate in this university, and that common goal is to impart to our children a life that is far better than the one that we are having right now. Okay, we do have a big subject tonight, so I want to introduce our panelists this evening. Let me start with Jeff Hunt. Jeff Hunt of course, has served as the director of the Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University and co-chairman of the Western Conservative Summit since 2015. In this role, he leads one of the largest annual gatherings of conservatives in the Western United States and hosts numerous notable speakers on the campus of Colorado Christian University. He oversees the Centennial Institute's lobbying team, working to shape policy at the Colorado Capitol to advance faith, family, and freedom. Jeff is also the editor of the Centennial Review, a monthly speech digest distributed to thousands of readers across the country. He is a regular writer and contributor to some of the biggest media outlets in the country. Jeff, thank you for hosting us, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Luigi.
Scott Wasserman has lived in Colorado for over 20 years and has had a long career in state politics and public policy. As president of the Bell Policy Center, he has worked to expand economic mobility for every Coloradan by educating policymakers about the state's fiscal options, fighting back against predatory practices, and advocating for two-generation solutions to economic and racial inequality. And prior to joining the Bell Public Policy Center, Scott served Governor John Hickenlooper as Deputy Chief of Staff and under Lieutenant Governors Joe Garcia and Donna Lynn, am I pronouncing that correctly?
You are.
As Chief of Staff. And in these roles, he wrote legislation creating the Colorado Opportunity Scholarship Initiative, oversaw government operations in times of emergency, and assisted state agency leaders in forging a more integrated approach to education and workforce issues. As I mentioned, we have a big subject tonight, and so let's get right to it. So I guess I'm going to start with Scott. Just briefly, how do you define Christian nationalism?
Well, thanks so much. And Jeff, thank you so much for your hospitality. I really appreciate the Colorado Christian University and the Centennial Institute hosting me for this dialogue. You know, and I guess I would start off by saying...
I'm sorry, Scott.
Yeah.
My mistake.
Yes.
Opening remarks, please.
Okay. All right. Opening remarks. Well, I'll start off like this. As Luigi said, this conversation kind of started on Twitter. From time to time, Jeff and I might spar back and forth, and he had made a comment, and I said, you know, that sounds awfully theocratic of you. And I think one of the challenges, and then you know, I asked for your response, and you said, well, that sounds like the perfect discussion we should have at Colorado Christian University. And I said, well, great, I accept. And what I also said is, but we're also sitting in a public forum right now, right here. Mm-hmm. Why can't you talk more about this? I think that for me, what I would say is that I've got a lot of questions. I've got a lot of questions about what Christian nationalism is. You know, over the past year or so, we have seen the emergence of politicians, notably Marjorie Taylor Greene, as well as Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, speak very overtly about this concept of Christian nationalism. I am a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists, is what Representative Greene said. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it, Congresswoman Boebert. And so it seems to me that there has been an emergence of Christian nationalism in this country. It seems to me that for a long time, its advocates have not wanted to talk about it in the public realm. But I think that we're at a point in our country where we need to have a candid conversation about it. We can't have a democracy if we can't intellectually trade our thoughts and be honest about what we really believe. And I think too often in this conversation, when we bring up the accusation that someone is a Christian nationalist, we're told, oh, well, you're putting words in my mouth. But I really do think that we've reached a moment in the dialogue, and I have other sources that I'll quote, where it seems that there's quite a well-developed thought process and ideology here. And so really, I'm here, I am a person of faith. I am a proud Jew. I believe strongly in the role of religion. The rhythms and prescriptions of religion are important to my family. I think they help us lead our lives, but I also think they're a horrible formula for political governance. because I'm also a historian. And if I look back at the last few centuries, I see a lot of bloodshed. And I see a lot of bloodshed around ecumenical questions that I believe have no role in governance. And I think that this is a bedrock value in America, and it has taken different forms. And I think, we got to be honest too, as people who are secularly inclined in this nation, that you could drive a Mack truck between the Establishment Clause and the Free Expression Clause. But nevertheless, this country has never had religion in the driver's seat. And so if we are turning the page, and if there is indeed a Christian nationalist movement in this country, I would like to learn about it and understand what impact it is going to have on my family, my community, and my many friends and neighbors who do not identify as Christian.
Thank you, Scott. Jeff?
All right. So I'm going to start by trying to define Christian nationalism through the lens of some of the media out there, particularly the Denver Post. So in many ways, we don't have a good definition for Christian nationalism. And if you read different newspapers, you get different definitions. So the Denver Post tried to put together a definition of Christian nationalism, which was really just kind of a collaboration of scary mischaracterization of conservative policies. They put them together, and then they put an umbrella over it, called it Christian nationalism, and then said it's everywhere, so beware of it. Let me give you some examples, and this comes really from the article. This was probably what spawned a little bit of our conversation. Lauren Boebert is part of a dangerous religious movement that threatens democracy. Oh my goodness, if someone's part of a dangerous movement that threatens democracy, let's go explore what that movement is. So here's their kind of definition. First, religious nationalism is a combination of religious takeover. Wow, takeover, religious takeover. What does that mean? They don't really define it. They link to another article. Is the Great Awakening a religious takeover of this nation? Is a revival a religious takeover of this nation? They don't really define it. So a religious takeover of the United States, falsehoods about the 2020 presidential election, not the 2016, but the 2020 presidential election, and then warnings of Judgment Day. I don't want to scare anybody, but pretty much every Sunday in a church, there's a warning about Judgment Day. At their core, quote, Christian nationalists believe that America holds a unique and divinely ordained purpose. Well, you could say that about any country. I believe pretty much every country has a unique and divinely ordained purpose. Whether it's America, whether it's Mexico, whether it's Canada, these are countries. They're part of God's provision in this world. They have a unique creation and divine ordination, in my opinion. Christian nationalists hold a strong sense of moral traditionalism. Yikes, moral traditionalism. Is that like 2008 Barack Obama? Because he believed in traditional marriage. Express comfort with authoritarian control and embrace strong ethno-racial boundaries. I actually had to look that up. What is an ethno-racial boundary? There's no definition to that. They kind of give you a secondary definition, particularly around national identities. So if you believe in your country, you believe in America, and you're a, quote, or you hold a strong sense of moral traditionalism, you are a Christian nationalist. But it's more than that. This is where it gets really scary for the Denver Post. Christian nationalism is a means of persuading large subsections of the American public to vote for the political candidates that the movement favors. It's a lot of words, but you got to dissect it right now. Christian nationalism is a means of persuading a large subsection of the American public to vote for the political candidate that the movement favors. You could swap out Christian nationalism with any political movement there. Pride parades is a means of persuading a large subsection of the American public to vote for the political candidate the movement favors. So you've got this kind of scary tactic of a misrepresentation of conservative policies like a border is good or we should have a well-armed citizenry. All these scary things they put together. And then they say, well, now they're trying to influence politics. So then they make it really, really scary. Then they say it's infiltrating, this is a quote, infiltrating virtually every level of American government and its judiciary. Wow, really scary stuff. It's a dog whistle for violence. Then they say this is not compatible with democracy. And they top it all off at the end of the article by connecting it with Vladimir Putin. This is like if you were creating a movie, a scary movie right around holiday season. Christian nationalism is here to infiltrate all elements of democracy. Oh, and by the way, at the very end of the movie, they're really all motivated by a connection with Vladimir Putin. It was just kind of crazy and outlandish. There's another book out there called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. It's by Whitehood and Perry. Here's their definition. It's a fusion of Christianity with American civic life that includes assumptions of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, along with the divine sanction of authoritarian control and militarism. So they basically have created this big, scary boogeyman, slapped Christian nationalism on it, and then in the case of the Denver Post, basically say every conservative out there is a Christian nationalist. Seriously, they say that Ron DeSantis, Rick Scott, Carrie Lake, all of them are Christian nationalists. So in many ways, it's just so over the top, and they try to attach it so much to every conservative out there that hold historically conservative positions that it's just kind of obscene. So what really is Christian nationalism? If you really want a definition of Christian, I kind of feel like Matt Walsh. Did you all see the movie What is a Woman, where he's wandering around trying to ask people the entire time what is a woman, and they can't really define it, and finally asks his wife, and she says, well, it's an adult female. So a Christian nationalist, in the midst of all these kind of wild definitions, really is a person that wants a Christian nation state. Okay, so why do I believe that that's the definition? Well, because there's lots of different ways to have your government, and the world, all over the world, there's different sets of governments. There are theocracies. Okay, the Vatican is a theocracy, Iran is a theocracy, Saudi Arabia is a theocracy. Theocracy has direct connection to religious leaders with regards to their government and the creation of those laws, right? You could have a theonomy, no one really talks about that, but that's basically where you throw out all of the laws and you just basically say, we're just gonna take the Old Testament and drop it in, and that's our laws. Okay, so you have theonomy, you have theocracy, but you also have religious states all over the world. You have Islamic nation states, you have a Jewish nation state, and you have Christian nation states. England is a Christian nation state. The Queen was the head of the Church of England. So there's different levels of connection. A Christian nationalist, properly defined, from my perspective, is someone that wants America to be a Christian nation state. Do we have 10 minutes or 7 minutes? Am I running over time?
I think you are running over time.
Okay.
You want to wrap it up?
So my argument, we'll get into this later, I don't think anyone's explicitly calling for America to be a Christian nation state. We can get into what that looks like, but I think what Marjorie Taylor Greene and what Lauren Boebert are often responding to is this kind of characterization that if you hold conservative values, you're somehow a Christian nationalist. That's not the case. We'll get later into it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Scott, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think 2 or 3 things just happened here, and I want to address them. I mean, I think I appreciate at the end of your opening statement that you did define Christian nationalism. But I think at the core of it, what I find problematic is that was a tremendously evasive opening remark to talk about the Denver Post coverage. You know, they are actually reacting to, not the other way around, comments that political leaders in our country are now saying very overtly. And I mean, I really can't get over Congresswoman Boebert's statement that the church is supposed to direct the government. Right. So one of the questions that I have for you, Jeff, and I don't want you to answer it right away, is do you believe that the church is supposed to direct the government? But I also have another question for you, because as I've done more and more research, the more it is apparent to me that there is a body of thought coming together. And in particular, you recently, I think last week, had a gentleman and a scholar from Israel named Yoram Hazony here. And he is a signator of a document called National Conservative, a Statement of Principles. And if none of you have read this document, I highly encourage you to read it. It had a number of signatures, including one of the biggest conservative funders in America, Peter Thiel. And I want to read to you the section on religion because I find it to be of interest. Where a Christian majority exists, public life should be rooted in Christianity and its moral vision, which should be honored by the state and other institutions, both public and private. At the same time, Jews and other religious minorities are to be protected in the observance of their own traditions, in the free governance of their communal institutions, and in all matters pertaining to the rearing and education of their children. Adult individuals should be protected from religious and ideological coercion in their private lives and in their homes. And I guess my question for you is, do you believe this? And in particular, do you believe this? Where a Christian majority exists, public life should be rooted in Christianity and its moral vision.
So Christians have been debating how the church interacts with the state for a long time. Going back to kind of Calvinist traditions, Abraham Kuyper. And a lot of this language, I think, seems scary if you haven't been educated in the role that the church has debated over these for a long time. So let me just give you an example of Abraham Kuyper's statement. I mean, this was from the 1900s. There's not a square inch in the whole dominion of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry out, mine. Okay, so Christians are looking at the role of Christ who says, I have all authority in heaven and earth. All right? So we believe that. It's not just authority in parts of it. We believe it's authority in all of it, in your business, in your family, and in government. So how does that work? Well, we've had a whole history of church history of people getting in control one particular denomination and persecuting others. In fact, you could say America was founded because they wanted to get away from that.
Yes.
Okay? There is also thought...
Did I hear you say yes, or did we actually have a point of agreement here?
I mean, and this is going to be one of my main assertions for this evening, which is that what makes America different historically was that they were running away from the very violent and bloody conflicts, ecumenical conflicts that had dominated Europe for the prior, you could say 3 centuries, or you could say even longer. Martin Luther, of all people, was the first one to begin to talk about secularism and the important need to separate the quote-unquote church from the quote-unquote state, even though those terms really didn't even exist at that time. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just take this opportunity to say, yes, I agree, and I would caution a Christian nationalist to look back on that history and to ponder how quickly it can turn against you. And I guess I'll just ask for a definition. You keep using this phrase Christian. Yeah. Which Christian? Because to my knowledge, we have hundreds of denominations. Here in America, maybe a generous definition would give Christians 40 to 45% in this nation. So I'd like to better understand, and I appreciate your explanation of Christian theology, but all the way back to St. Augustine, there has been a real struggle within Christianity, both to define what Christianity means denominationally, as well as what does it mean, what is the difference between the city of God and the city of man? And this has been a long contemplation, and I think America is a reaction to the bloodshed that occurred in Europe.
Before you answer that one, Jeff, I just wanted to ask you specifically.
I've got a lot of questions here.
Yes, you are going to get a lot of questions. And you'll also get the chance to answer every single one of them. But you were saying that from a Christian point of view, yes, the idea of a government somehow under the purview of a sovereign being, yes, that language, which is purely in religious, purely within a religious landscape, yes, is not surprising to anyone who is Christian, is familiar to anyone who regularly goes to church, hears that kind of approach to worldly affairs, if you will, and when that language is filtered through, let's say, the media or Twitter, my favorite medium, it becomes, as you point out, a big, scary boogeyman. Is that what you're saying?
Partially, and I think we've moved away from religious education or religious connected education, so people get really concerned about this, like Judgment Day, like the Denver Post is going, oh my goodness, there's someone who, for instance, embraces the Second Amendment and believes that Judgment Day is here, so things must be really bad. So let me go back to why I don't think what we're facing in America is actually Christian nationalism, okay? So if we were arguing for Christian nationalism, you would see elected officials, major movements, major leaders within the conservative movement asking for a change to actually how America's set up, okay? So there are Christian states out there. And the hallmarks of Christian states are, one, the declaration of an official church. You don't really see that. You don't see a call for the repeal of Article 6 protections, the religious tests. No one's saying that only Christians or only those that abide by a certain faith can be elected, okay? So what you're actually asking for, in my view of the context that we're in, is a reaction to neo-Marxism, which is seeking to remove any perspective of Christianity from the public square so that they can have total control of the policies that are being made. And so it is a reaction against that people are going, no, the government, in Lauren Boebert's speech there, the government should not control the church. She says that in her speech. It's both and. So now she may say that the church can control the government, and there's a proper critique of what's called sphere sovereignty. So this is a Christian thought that in all of God's creation, there's certain spheres. You have the sphere of the family, you have the sphere of the church, you have the sphere of the government. And in Catholic social thought, it's called subsidiarity, that the most power should belong to the most local control. So the government should not have control over the family, but the family doesn't necessarily have control over the government either, right? And the church doesn't have control over the government. No one is asking that America should become a theocracy. No one is asking that I'm aware of. I mean, there might be people out there, but government leaders within the general conservative movement right now are not calling for America to become a theocracy. They're not calling for America to become a Christian state. What they're arguing for is the right and the ability to express their Christian principles in the public square in an effort to convince the systems that are set up, that we already exist, to reflect their values. And I'll close with this. At Colorado Christian University, we have politics students. I run the Centennial Institute. What are we training? Are we training people to be a Christian nationalist? Not in the definition of wanting to establish a Christian state. What we are training people to be is Christian statesmen, inheriting the values of Jerusalem, Rome, and Greece. And so I think a lot of this debate comes from the idea that we think that these Christian, Republican, or conservative lawmakers want just the Bible. And I think they're impacted in a big way by the traditions of Rome. I think they're impacted by the traditions of Greece. And I don't think that they're advocating for the creation of a Christian state. Go ahead.
Luigi, and thank you, Jeff. I mean, I want to address two things. First of all, the statements of so many political leaders on the scene right now belie the statements that you've just made. And I want to be clear, Lauren Boebert was very explicit. The church is supposed to direct the government. She did say that. And we also know that when we have Muslim representatives in the Congress, there have been Christian conservatives who have challenged their right to be on that floor, their right to wear their traditional garb. I wish the world were as you are depicting it. Unfortunately, there are a multitude of political movements. There are a number of emergent political leaders who have become more and more brazen in their statements. It is, as a Jew, remarkably challenging to watch a president of the United States, in this case Donald Trump, in the Oval Office, surrounded by evangelical leaders, laying their hands upon him, blessing him. It is remarkably challenging as a Jew in this country to watch Donald J. Trump march through a rally brutally, pushing citizens aside and then holding a Bible in his hand. What are we to glean from those statements? And so the first thing I want to say is that I wish that were the case. But unfortunately, the way the world is playing out right now, conservatives are saying something very different. When you have someone like Peter Thiel, who is a massive conservative funder in this country, signing a document like this, these are radical principles. And let me be clear, earlier in the document, they're directly confronting liberalism. Now, I want to take issue with your statement that you are reacting to neo-Marxism.
Yes.
Man, everybody's gotten really confused with all of these labels. What you are describing...
We almost have very closely now have a definition of Christian nationalism just based on this conversation.
We do, but what bothers me is that to call, now, it seems now that it's in dispute whether or not there are Christian nationalists in this country. What you're describing does not match what I am watching and have been watching for the past 5 years. But what you're describing as neo-Marxism is a well-established tradition of separatist secularism in America. And there are different forms of secularism. America has an extremely separatist form of secular government. France has a much more aggressive form of secular government. India has an accommodationist form of secular government. But to call it neo-Marxism, I think, is tremendously disturbing. And it's one of the reasons why, and I hate to bring, unfortunately, Colorado politics and the Colorado Springs Gazette into this, but when we see editorials that are being written that say that, well, Nazism was actually socialism, this kind of plasticity, this kind of, sort of being loose with the terms is tremendously scary because it reminds me of a different era in which these terms and labels were used to confuse people about what was really going on. So I guess what I would challenge you to do is reframe what you are reacting to.
Sure.
Okay, because it is not neo-Marxism. What you are reacting to is secularism as it manifests in America. And let's acknowledge that America in 2022 is very different than America in 1800. And we have a very diverse public. And, again, if you want to lump Mormons in with mainline Protestants, with evangelicals and Catholics, maybe you get to 50%. But there is not a Christian majority in this country. In fact, a Pew study came out just last month showing that 1 out of 6 Americans would like to see this country as a, quote, Christian country.
Yeah. So, let me define neo-Marxism, because I think it would help understand what is happening in this country. And this is going to be informed by Yoram Hazony, who I think is right on this. So, how did we get to Berkeley 1960s free speech type of values, right? Everybody has free speech. We all have religious freedom. We're going to allow religions to be able to practice what they believe. We're not going to just sequester them. They can be in the public square. How did we get from that to the prosecution of Jack Phillips, from Amy Coney Barrett being told that the dogma speaks loudly in her, almost as if there's a new secularism religious test, right? How do you get to 303 Creative, the upcoming Supreme Court case? How do you get the treatment of Ben Sass by the University of Florida faculty, right? So it's almost, in many ways, it feels like Christians can't even hold public jobs anymore. So how did we get from all religions, free speech, universal human rights, to the punishment of people specifically because of their faith? Because things have changed. I think most of us were raised as classical liberals, right? We want to have freedom of speech. We want to have different religions be able to practice their faith, to be able to compete. We generally hold that. That's a classical liberal, Jeffersonian approach. There are universal human rights that are, irregardless of the culture, that should be embraced. And Yoram Hazony argues that the fall of this took place at the New York Times in 2020 with the firing of Barry Weiss and the firing of traditional classical liberals, to a new set of woke neo-Marxism. And the definition of that is we are now placing people in categories. Those categories are competing against each other. There are oppressors, there are the oppressed. And we put people in categories based upon their race. We put people in categories based upon their gender. We put people in their categories based upon their sexualities. We put people in categories based upon their economics. And now we've created a system where all these groups are fighting against each other. And if you are a white male evangelical, you are part of the most oppressive category. And therefore, you must be shut down in every capacity that you can. You don't have the right to bring your values into the public square. You don't have the right to be employed. You don't have the right to any of that because you are an oppressor. So when we talk about the response to neo-Marxism, it's a response to that reality that's taken place in our culture. And what people are saying, what I think Boebert's saying, and I'm not going to defend Lauren Boebert in all of her comments, I do not think that America is a unique country in the same way that Israel is identified by God. So I will have disagreements. But I think a lot of this response is this push out of religion from the public square because it is an oppressive regime that needs to be silenced.
So,
Go ahead. Luigi, if I may.
Yeah.
In every generation, there is an awakening and an evolution of thought and discussion. In Victorian England, there were debates over divorce and, what rights women should have. Mm-hmm. We continue to argue about these issues to this day. In every millennia, there is a reaction to the dominant thought process, a reflection on history. What you are describing as neo-Marxism, which in America is an incredibly loaded and I think misguided term, is really the evolution of thought. There is an awakening in this country. You've just mixed a lot of different things. There is an awakening in this country to the legacy of racism. There is an awakening in this country of the socioeconomic circumstances that many people have been born into. And there is a critique of what the dominant culture has been. And that's what happens in every country. If what you are saying is that Christians are reacting by saying, well, we want this country to more closely reflect our values, then fine. But say so publicly and say that, we are in fact Christian nationalists and we want this country to be guided by a certain set of principles. Now, I have a whole list of questions for you about what those principles are, because if your faith is anything like my faith, we can't agree on much, and so. But what I have trouble with here is the shifting of the conversation. I mean, we just talked about faith and government, and you just started talking about political conversations that really have very little to do with theology and religion, and have a lot to do with the moment we're in and the thoughtful awakening that's occurring across. And we have spirited dialogue on the left. We're not all in agreement, as I'm sure you're not on the right. But the solution to this is not the national conservative statement of principles, which says that the Bible is above all else the primary document for Western civilization. And I do quibble with this idea. In Judaism, we don't go directly to the Bible. We have something called the Talmud. We have generations, a transmission of interpretation. God forbid we should govern ourselves the way they govern themselves in the Bible. So I guess I'm a little confused about why you are confusing the issues and why you won't confront directly this question of whether or not religion has a place in governance.
Yes, it does. It absolutely has a place in governance. So I think you're hard-pressed to find any law that is not based upon a set of values. Okay, so now you can claim that there are secular values. Those values, the secularism, is still a set of values. And the religious critique of secular values is that they often change with the wind, right? So 5 years ago, we never would have been talking about multiple genders. Now, you can say that's an awakening, but I say that's a lot of confusion. So religion brings a set of values, and what we often see as conservatives is that the only critique of people bringing religious values in is of conservatives trying to bring in religious values. So if I'm a liberal Christian, and I am motivated by my faith to eliminate the death penalty, to expand government, to get rid of Tabor, so I can come up with new government programs to care for the poor, I'm not critiqued for bringing my values into the public square. I'm only critiqued if I tend to be a conservative trying to bring in my religious values. So I absolutely believe that what has made this country so wonderful is that Orthodox Jews, Reformed Jews, Christians, Protestants, Catholics, Mormons, Muslims, even atheists can bring their values to the public square and say, these are the values that I believe are going to make for human flourishing, and I believe our laws should reflect those.
But one point, and then I promise, Luigi, I'll let
Go
you
ahead,
continue
yeah.
to moderate.
I'm just here to listen.
There's so many other
Go
points I
ahead,
could
go
make.
ahead, please.
No, I mean, when I go down to the state capitol and I advocate against Tabor, I don't begin the conversation by saying, my name is Scott Wasserman, I am a Jew, I believe these things, and that is why I want to get rid of Tabor. We all have, and I embrace everyone's faith background. But to assert my religion as the reason for my political position is very different than entering a public discourse and talking about those issues, recognizing that that's not common ground. If I walk into a room and I say, my name is Scott Wasserman, I'm a proud Jew, and because of that I believe X, I'm going to lose 90% of the room. Okay, and I've watched, as you watch, when people walk into the state capitol and say, I am a proud Christian and I believe we should do X, you're going to lose half the room. This is not how we have our political discourse, or have traditionally had our political discourse in this country. And if we are going to start having our political discourse in this country, then we should acknowledge it. And that is a radical turning of the page.
I want to ask you just a really quick follow-up on that one. Is it possible, to your mind, to create an entirely new set of values? You may call them completely secular values, from the structure that we now have undergirding the kind of government and polity that we now have in the United States. Is that possible, and how is it possible to extricate, or maybe extricate is not the right term, but to create something completely new?
Yes.
Is that even doable?
I'm so glad you asked that question. And that's exactly the question that I wanted to go into, because you talked about values. And the beautiful thing is we don't have to reinvent values if we want to live in a secular society.
So we can have...
There are
Go ahead.
10 values that undergird secularism. And I want to talk about some of them. Or I can talk about all 10 of them. One is equality, okay? And one need only go to the Bible. In Judaism, we call it B'Tselem Elohim. We are all created in the image of God, okay? Another value.
A value that, by the way, takes away the focus from a monarch, a king, and puts it in the individual.
Well,
by
we're
saying-
actually not there yet.
Okay, go
right?
ahead.
So,
Yes, please.
so the first value,
I'm
right,
getting ahead
and
of
the
myself.
first bedrock of what we know of today is secularism. I mean, we talk about secularism. That phrase didn't even come into being until the 1800s, England. Okay, so secularism as a concept has been evolving over the course of 2,000 years. Other values are that there are two powers in this world, right? What many Christians would talk about is the world of man and the world of God, the city of God, the city of man, right? But that there's some distinction between these two things, okay? That there's a difference between the monarch who has power and the church who holds sway over spirituality. Another one is internal constraint. This comes from Martin Luther. We can't just do whatever we want to do. We understand that we live in a society, and we understand that we have to tolerate each other. Freedom of conscience. Martin Luther, Roger Williams. If you read the charter that created the state of Rhode Island, talks about tolerance and freedom of consciousness. I could go on. Order, I want us to talk later about order when we talk about the more controversial subjects like abortion. At the end of the day, you have a freedom of expression, but at what cost does that freedom of expression come at? And let's fast forward to abortion. If we live in a world like the national conservatives believe, where if you happen to find yourself in a place of Christian majority and now my Jewish community is under your protection, we have a very different set of beliefs around abortion. And so if we are practicing our faith and we in fact believe that the fetus is the pursuer and that the primary value is protecting a woman's life, and we feel that an abortion is medically necessary, and the Christian majority community says, this is an affront to us, this is an abomination, how do we maintain order? These are some of the reasons why there are values in secularism. This is not neo-Marxism. This is a 2,000-year-old evolving tradition of how to keep ourselves from killing each other. And I could go on. But the point is that toleration, order, the idea that we are all created in God's image, these are fundamental disciplined values. And I don't think you're necessarily giving us credit for how far along we've... So to answer your question, Luigi, is the beautiful thing is I don't need to make this stuff up. We've been working on this for 2,000 years.
What you're saying is you could borrow from Christian fundamentals or Jewish fundamentals in the way you approach life. Take those values, put them under a list, call them secular values, if you will, and what you're saying is this is what we as a society should pursue.
I'm saying, yeah, I'm saying one of the most fascinating things is that secularism is within itself a religious conversation. Secularism is not atheism. Secularism is a theological, by definition, conversation about what is the relationship between spirituality and governance. What is the relationship between peoples of different faith? So I guess all I'm trying to say is that secularism is a far more traditional set of values than I think is being given credit tonight. We are not cutting from whole cloth these things. We have learned important lessons. We have watched as 20 million people died between the 30 and 80 years war in Europe. We have learned lessons. And we have also seen the excesses of dogmatic atheism. Soviet secularism led to the slaughter of 20 million people. So somewhere in between the middle has got to be a good way of governing ourselves, and that is what we know of as secularism.
So can I ask a question, though? So Nat Khan's statement there is to try to figure out why those values don't work in Afghanistan. We spent trillions of dollars and a lot of lives to try to establish democracies. And I used to run around the United Nations. I used to work at the United Nations on behalf of persecuted Christians. On one hand, you have international bodies that have just horribly failed. The most anti-Semitism I've ever seen was at the United Nations. Gross anti-Semitism. America tries to establish a lot of those values in a place like Afghanistan. Why didn't it work?
I think the answer to that is far more complicated and really beyond much of this conversation, because so much of it is rooted in history. To be quite honest, why couldn't America instill those values in Afghanistan? Why couldn't the Soviet Union instill whatever values and global objectives it had in Afghanistan? So if we want to talk...
Don't forget the British.
And the British, right. So I think there's, again, history is really critical to these conversations. And when I hear the comments of someone like Congresswoman Boebert, with all due respect, I don't think she's been paying attention to history. Now, you've mentioned Yoram Hazony.
Yes.
And I want to talk about Israel.
Yeah.
I have been involved, and I always get a little emotional because it's so important to me in my life and my identity. And I've been involved in the conversation about Israel. I am a Zionist. I believe in the principles of that country, and I just got the opportunity to go back there this summer. Had been 22 years. I had been boycotting the Netanyahu regime, and so finally got an opportunity to go back to Israel. I don't think I like what I saw. I think I saw a country, and Yoram Hazony is part of a very dangerous movement in Israel that has radically altered this country. And I could give you endless examples of how his form of religious nationalism is leading to horrible, violent persecution in the occupied territories and is hurting the moral compass of the state of Israel that I love. So, I don't want to talk about Afghanistan. I want to talk about what is going on in places like Israel, where, there has been a soft agreement with the Orthodox for, 75 years. And now you have a population of ultra-Orthodox in the state of Israel, many of whom don't learn math, barely learn science. Only 10% of ultra-Orthodox in Israel even speak English as compared to most Israelis that do. We have the same problem in Brooklyn, where you have citizens of America who get on buses and are being assaulted by ultra-Orthodox who don't believe that they should sit there. So this experiment that is wrapped up into my DNA has led, I think we have to examine it. And I think we are getting very close to the Samuel Huntington vision of a clash of civilizations. And I think let's not talk about Afghanistan. Let's talk about America. Let's talk about Israel. Let's talk about the places where religious fundamentalists have pushed these ideas, and it is leading to very, very bad outcomes.
So we have about 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to allow the audience to ask questions. But I do want to kind of try and bring us back to Christian nationalism and how it manifests itself. Now, so Jeff, let me pose that question to you. Per your definition of Christian nationalism, what then becomes its attributes?
So I am not interested in America becoming an explicitly Christian nation state. I'm not. And there might be people out there.
That means a theocracy. That means
No, it doesn't mean a theocracy. It means an official alignment with Christianity. Either a declaration by the government, which would require removing of the Article 6 protections. I think if you read, especially the treatment of the Baptists during the early parts of this country where they had to apply for licenses to preach, I don't want that. I don't want that at all. When I look at America, I see an inherited tradition of Jerusalem, of Greece, and of Rome. Those traditions have come together with a tremendous amount of historical reflection to create a society where Judaism's allowed to flourish, Mormonism's allowed to flourish, Catholicism's allowed to flourish, evangelicalism's allowed to flourish, and I think Islam as well. We have representatives from the Islam faith here. So that has created a society that I think is great. What I am critiquing and what I'm concerned about is, and I think you and I would agree that classical liberalism created a lot of opportunity. I think I see the death of it. I'm not sure you agree with me on that. I think we have moved to a place where I have watched particularly conservative evangelicals be pushed out of the public square specifically because they are conservative evangelicals. And that needs to be addressed. But I don't like the treatment of Amy Coney Barrett in her nomination process. That should have been condemned from every language. Who cares what her Catholic faith leads her to believe? But it was a major issue. So I think there's not a threat of Christian nationalism in this country. There's not an effort either by the elected officials or by major conservatives to try to explicitly align this country through law with Christianity to prevent people of faith from being able to hold office. I don't see that. So those efforts out there to be either become Christian nation states or theocracy aren't even on the spectrum.
Go ahead, Scott, and then we'll transition to the audience.
There's so much to say. I think one of the things, I'll say this, you have a building on your campus named after Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I don't know if everyone here is familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. he was a Christian of consciousness, right? A conscientious objector. And he was objecting to the fact that Nazi Germany essentially took over the churches of Germany and created a German church and died for
100%.
it. You know, for many of us, and I see that you can't see this, but for many of us, I don't understand how a person of faith can ally themselves with Donald Trump. Can you look me in the eye and tell me that Donald Trump is a good, upstanding man of faith, a good Christian? It's these entanglements. And I hear you, and I want to believe you, and yet we see otherwise. We see, and I question every single day. I do not understand the rhetoric of those who are pro-life in this country, who object to abortion, but then want to maintain policies that don't feed children, that leave them in poverty. There are these contradictions, and they are troubling, and they are scary. And I will say that I think why Amy Coney Barrett's faith and dogma came under questioning was because she was going to the Supreme Court. And the biggest worry in the nation for many, many, many people was whether or not Roe v. Wade would be overturned. And she got to that desk, she put her hand on the Bible, she was asked, do you believe that Roe v. Wade is precedent? Do you think it's going to be overturned? No. What happened just months later? And now this country is grappling with the consequences. And so what I would say to you is her faith and dogma was being questioned because she was going to the highest court of the land, and we were asking her if that faith was going to drive her to reach a conclusion that would have a profound impact on a critical issue in this country. And she did exactly what people feared she would do. So I hear you. I want to believe that what you're telling me is the way that things are playing out. But what we see in the world today, the actions that we are seeing, this weird entangling and weaving of things that go beyond faith with communities of faith is deeply troubling. And that's, I think, what is haunting me in this conversation. And I appreciate what you're saying. I think we're seeing something very different.
I think we can kind of
questions.
I think we can kind of lock in some of our gains here and ask the audience for feedback and questions. And I think the only requirement I would have is you have to be a subscriber to Color to Politics and the Denver Gazette before you can ask a question.
How about that it has to be a question?
Yes, no statements. We're going to go straight to
Has to be a
questions.
question, no statements, obviously. And obviously, keep it short and to the point. So go ahead. We do have, I didn't get your name?
Casey James.
Casey's over there. If you have questions,
We have
please
student
go
over
ahead.
here too. So just raise your hand.
Casey and Anna.
Okay, we'll go question here. Very quick. She'll hold the mic.
A term which was not brought up tonight was, should the church, should Christianity be a check on the government? Should it be the conscience of the government? How do you address that?
I believe so. Absolutely. Now, does it mean that I want to force everybody into a Christian worldview? No. I don't believe that my faith spreads that way. I believe people freely engage their faith, but I believe that there is absolutely a God in this universe, and there are laws. He is a God that governs in the affairs of men, and that good laws benefit everyone. There's what we call common grace, that even if you're not a believer, having good right, this is Proverbs 29:2, that when the righteous are in control, the people celebrate. When those aren't, people mourn. So there is a common grace that benefits everybody, a human flourishing that takes place. It's what we call natural law. There's a reason why this world celebrates people like Mother Teresa, and for the most part condemns people like Adolf Hitler, because there is a natural law to this world. And when people are good, Paul gets into this in the New Testament. Why are there no laws banning gentleness, kindness, goodness, faithfulness? Because there's a natural order to this world, and I think that's good. Now, do I think that, and I believe the church should be a check on it. Look, my patron saint is William Wilberforce. That is the person I want to emulate, and I think did a fantastic job as a Christian in politics. He was already elected into office and came to faith and felt like maybe he should leave politics and just become a pastor. And his pastor, John Newton, said no. The author of Amazing Grace, that song, said you need to go back into politics. And over 60 years labored to bring about an end to the slave trade. Wonderful example of the conscience of the church and of believers guiding the direction of government to recognize that Africans were not property. They were human beings, created in the image of God. That is a wonderful check of the church on government, in my opinion.
I don't know which church we're talking about. I mean, I don't believe that the church should be a check on government because I see many churches. I see synagogues. I see so many different forms of worship. So I think that the second we start talking about the church being a check on government, it begs this much broader question of which church. I mean, that was the immediate thing I thought when Congresswoman Boebert said that. Now, and again, I started this conversation saying, I am a person of faith. We are involved in our synagogue. I look to my rabbi as a friend and as a guide. I believe in having conversations that are inspired by faith. I think that, and one thing we might agree on is that I do think we have a crisis in our time. I think people feel deeply unrooted from long traditions. I remember recently going to this Shiva, which is a Jewish practice after someone dies. We were sitting around, and a friend of ours who really is not rooted in any faith was like, wow, like, I don't even know what I would do if my parents died. Like, I have zero guidance for how I would respond to, this moment of grief. So I think religion is important, and I think that people of faith are the check on government, that people are inspired by whatever inspires them to then go to the streets or testify in committee. But the second the church, a church, begins to be a check on government, now I get worried. Because now we've chosen a church. Which church? Who are you talking to? Which faction? Which sect? This leads to chaos. And we know this from history.
Next question. Stacy. Do we have questions from online viewers?
Yes, we have a question from YouTube.
All
and
right.
It's, can you both talk about the values this country were founded upon? And do those values differ from biblical principles?
You get to go first.
Scott.
Yeah, so I got to tell you, I've been, I did a little bit of research coming into this, had to dust off some books that I read in college. I mean, you read the Constitution, there's not a single mention of God. There's no question that our founding fathers, some of them were people of faith, some of them were blatantly not, some of them were deists. I think it's really interesting to look at, and we shouldn't just talk about the founding fathers, by the way, they were founding mothers as well. They were people who came, I think they were deeply scarred from the wars that followed the Reformation. I think they were deeply scarred from things that they saw transpiring in England and elsewhere. We know that deism was a practice that many of them practiced. We also know that some of them were devout Christians. We know that some of them were Catholics and Baptists and so on and so forth. But as you read the Constitution, I was a little shocked because I thought I'd see somewhere in that document some mention of providence, and I didn't. And so, and now I will say that, James Madison, when he drafted the First Amendment, that's some sloppy writing. 16 words on the role of government and free expression, you gotta be kidding me. And as I said in the beginning, you could drive a truck through there. Now, was that intentional? Were they avoiding questions that they knew would be divisive, and so let's just move on? But I actually think that the faith of the quote-unquote founding fathers is remarkably absent from our founding documents. And it's very interesting. We hear this phrase, separation of church, and much of this was through private correspondence, right, that later we would find. But as I look at the founding texts of this nation, and I keep hearing you use this phraseology, Jerusalem, Greece, and Rome. Certainly I agree on the Greece and Rome part. That was very top of mind for the quote-unquote founding fathers. Not seeing a lot of Jerusalem in there. And I think a lot of that comes later in how people interpreted those documents.
So we published a document here, you can pick it up on the way out, called America's Three Great Founding Documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bible. So yes, the Constitution does not explicitly mention God. The Declaration of Independence does, and every single state constitution in America, all 50 of them, including the Colorado Declaration, mention a deity, divine providence. In many cases, especially the early documents, you had religious tests, which I do not agree with, but those were much part of the first 13 colonies. An analysis of the early writings of the founders found that the Bible was the most referenced document in the writings around the time of the founding of this country than any other document combined. And so we believe that the Bible is essential to the founding of America. There's a great quote from a poet that says, "Every movement of human freedom speaks in a Hebrew accent." To tie back to Moses fleeing Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And so I think many of the founders looked at not only the notions of liberty and independence through that lens, I think they looked at each human being as being unique and individual with specific rights endowed by their creator. I think that especially comes from a Judeo-Christian worldview. So I think it was critical to the founding of this nation.
I think we have room for one more question.
Uno más. Any students want to ask any questions? All right. Go ahead.
John Adams once notably said that our Constitution was written for a religious people and it is wholly inadequate for the government of any others. So would you say that our Constitution and our founding documents are able to govern a non-religious people or a secular people or a diversity of a mixture of each? Or do you think that they have to believe a certain set of religious ideas in order to be governed by our documents?
Do you want me to start first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you repeat that last part?
So do you think that the people have to conform to, or do you have to agree with or believe a certain set of religious or moral principles in order to be effectively governed by our current system of government?
Yeah, so John Adams was dealing also too with this kind of debate over what is freedom, what is liberty. In some cases, you have liberty is defined as licentiousness. I think that Colorado really struggles with that. We think that liberty is the ability to smoke pot in your basement, kill yourself when you want, kill any baby that you want. That's all falls under this notion of liberty. I think that's license. I think it's an improper understanding of that. So they're looking at the true definition of liberty. You cannot have limited government in America or any country without self-government. What's the best way we get to self-government? I think my friend here, Scott, believes that we can come up with secular values that are sustainable. I don't think they are. I think they collapse. I think we're watching them collapse now, because what's the root of holding secular values? What's the foundation of it? So I think America only can flourish when you have self-government, and the best way for self-government, from my perspective, is with strong religious values. I tweeted this the other night. I was with some young Jewish people from a nearby university. If you took a young Jewish person, a young Mormon person, a young Catholic person, a young evangelical person, and you put them all together, they seem very similar. They have a lot of self-control. They're bright, they're kind. I think religious values does wonderful things for character development. And so I think what we're seeing, and I think probably where the root of our disagreement is today, is I think secularism is collapsing into chaos, and we're seeing it in our culture. Drug use, youth suicide, there's no values, there's no direction, there's no truth. And I can get into a longer conversation on how I think that's going to lead to authoritarianism, but I think our government can only flourish with strong religious moral values.
You know, it's funny, 400 years ago, if you put me in a room with a bunch of Christians in Europe, I'd be dead. But, you know, I appreciate that very recently there's been this conflation of Judeo-Christian values. But let's not kid ourselves about the way religion and Christianity has treated the Jews and other cultures. You know, I think what's really interesting is that there's this idea of order, and I didn't really get to that. And Roger Williams spoke quite a bit about this in the founding of the state of Rhode Island, the colony of Rhode Island. There are also a number of other states, some of the Carolinas and others, that what's missing from the First Amendment, right, is this idea that your free expression cannot go so far as to disrupt order, cannot go so far as to impinge upon civility and civil life, right? And so, like, there is this idea that there are limits. I also want to acknowledge that we've been having a very Western-facing conversation today. There's an interesting article I was reading that talked about when you survey Americans about religiosity, you find growing numbers of Americans who don't claim any faith. But one of the things they see is a huge representation from Asians in this idea that, well, I'm not religious. And that's because what we've neglected to talk about in so much of this conversation, like in China, Confucianism, is that a religion or is that a moral, ethical code? I think so I think I would just I think you're asking a good question. I think that America has, there's also a part of me that doesn't really care what the founding fathers had to say. We don't look anything like what America looked like in the late 1700s. We don't look anything like what America looked like it's only until the really 1900 that these issues and cases started coming up. If you look at the case law, you know, things like the Lemon Test, some of the things that the Supreme Court has ruled on, these issues, we are now a multicultural nation, not just of Western cultures and Western religions, but of Eastern cultures and religion. So, you know, look, I hear what you're saying. And as I said, there is a crisis going on. I think people feel deeply unrooted, and I want people to feel rooted. But I don't know if one of these religions is the right one, because it may be something else, right? So I don't think religion is the key here. I think that a lot of our look at who our founding fathers were. They wrote from what they knew. I get it. But today we are something different. And I think thank God for secularism, because if we didn't have that, I do think, I think we would be seeing chaos, the likes of which we already saw in Europe 500 years ago.
Scott and Jeff, I think we're very close to the end.
Yes.
Scott, you gave the first remarks. I'll give you the opportunity to do it now.
Yeah.
Do the closing remarks now.
Yeah. I just want honesty. I think there's just a lot of gaslighting in the American political discourse. You know, in my day job, I don't talk about this stuff. This has been fun. Thank you, Jeff. I get to talk about Tabor and taxes, and that's not nearly as exciting. But in that conversation, as well as in this one, I feel like there's a lot of hiding of the ball. You know, if Lauren Boebert is a Christian nationalist, then she should say so. Marjorie Taylor Greene has said so, and I suppose I should thank her. Thank you for being intellectually honest and telling us where you're coming from, because now I can have an intellectually honest conversation with you and debate on what we're actually disagreeing over. And what I would ask of Jeff and others is say what you mean what you say. Perhaps a mistake of secularism, and I've been in these environments where we shut people down. You know, if you have a rogue idea in the classroom or in the political discourse and you say it, let's hear it. I'm not afraid of it. We should talk about it. But what I don't like is the gaslighting. is yeah, you just saw Donald Trump walk through a rally and then hold up a Bible, but we're going to act like that didn't happen. That's what troubles me. And so I hope this conversation continues. I think we need to have more of these dialogues, but let's say what we mean, and let's have. And I would challenge those on the left, my friends on the left. Have a thicker skin. It's okay to hear someone disagree with you, okay? But same on the right. Dialogue is key. You know, if nothing else, what I know of the Founding Fathers is that they enjoyed a good debate, and they had long debates, and they were frank, and they were candid. You know, and this is the last thing I'll say. I was reading, I don't even remember what it was. It was, if anyone hasn't seen the U.S. and the Holocaust, by the way, you really must. It's a fascinating documentary. But I was marveling at the way people talked back then and before that in American politics. And they used really big words, and they gave really elaborate speeches, and they talked about the kinds of things that we're talking about. And today, our political discourse is trash. We talk in sound bites. We don't talk honestly. And I think we're missing each other. And Jeff and I clearly have some big differences, but at least we can talk about them. And that's what I would leave you with. Like, I'm deeply concerned about what this movement that I see emerging means for me and my family and for my kids' future. But gosh darn it, like, let's have that conversation and debate.
I appreciate that. As you know, we often invite friends from different perspectives to come up here, and we almost never see them. So, Scott, thank you for your bravery. I know I had the home field advantage, and it can be intimidating to walk into a place that you're not familiar with, and you did so wonderfully and graciously. So thank you very much, and I agree. I hope we can have more of this. I think we have a different analysis of what's happening, but I think our principles are generally similar. So I'm looking at the fall of the classical liberal beliefs and philosophies that we had. Our friends from Alliance Defending Freedom, who defended Jack Phillips, tried to host an event at Yale recently, and it was completely shut down, not even allowed to talk. And the event was about freedom of speech. It was about freedom of speech, and they couldn't even host it. We've had friends drugged before government entities for the last 8 years, like Jack Phillips. We've got another one coming up here shortly. We've watched essentially religious tests in secularism be implemented upon government holders in this nation. And I think that's a problem. The original question was, is Christian nationalism a threat to America? Christian nationalism, as I believe it should be defined, because I think it needs to be clearly defined, as an effort to create a Christian nation state, would be a threat to America if I saw efforts to do that. I don't. The response of Christian nationalism that often comes from Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert is a response to that effort that I read at the beginning of the Denver Post, to basically mischaracterize traditionally conservative positions, create one big umbrella, call it Christian nationalism, say it's insidious and affecting every part of our nation, claim basically every conservative out there is a Christian nationalist, and call it a threat to democracy, a dog whistle for violence. So I think their response is often to that effort by the media. I think what makes America great is that it is, as I mentioned, the combination of Jerusalem, Rome, and Greece. That's what we're training our students to be here. To be Christian statesmen, not Christian nationalists. To work within the traditions that have made this country great, separation of powers, democracy, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, but to be people of tremendous faith and values, to let that be the foundation upon which they establish their principles and how they want to argue passionately within the public square. I think that's good. As I mentioned, I was with young Jewish students last night. They say they want to create Jewish leaders. I think that's wonderful. We need people of deep, profound commitment to faith with their values, operating within the public square, upon the traditions that we have embraced in this country. And I think it'll continue to make America great. So, thanks.
It has been incredible to be here. Jeff, thank you so much for inviting me. And Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I can't remember who said it. The one thing that keeps repeating in my mind is something along these lines. Democracy is a dialogue with the dead. We're still trying to validate the propositions of our forebears. And it's messy and it's difficult. I am very glad to see a young man here with us, young men and young women here with us. And I remember the words of Jose Rizal, the Filipino national hero, who said that the youth is the hope of the nation. Now, in my culture, in my Filipino culture, we defer to the counsel of our elders. And that's the way we brought up. For him to say that is for him to challenge, perhaps invert that idea, and to say that the future of a country rests with the young people. So I am very glad to see young people here. And to those who are viewing or listening, I am so very happy that you took the time to do so. Let me just leave you with the words of the great G.K. Chesterton. Democracy, he said, is like, what did he say? It's like blowing one's nose, he said. You may not do it very well, but you ought to do it yourself. And with that, thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
These are gifts from the Centennial Institute for your wife and for yourself. This is a gift from us.
Thank you very much.
This is 1776.
All right.